to another episode of I'm a Software Engineer. What next? Thanks for joining me again, Matt.
G'day, glad to be here.
Have you got a new t-shirt for us this week? Is that a new one or an old one?
Well, I think it's an old new one, kind of retro. I spent a lot of time hunting for coins in the coin return slot of a video game arcade so I could play video games because I never had enough money to play them when I was a kid. So that's my sob story to get things started. Now I'm wearing the t-shirt.
What does that one say?
I don't think it says anything. It just says I'm a massive nerd from the 70s and early and 80s.
That's what it screams. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it
Nice.
screams.
I like it. We're going to run out of shirts soon. You're going to have to have some more
recycle them.
birthdays or Christmases, I think. Anyway, moving on. This week, I'm really excited. We've got a guest on that I think is going to be really cool, particularly for those early on in their career or even thinking about getting into software engineering. We're going to be joined by Ali Peroulis. He's a software engineer whose career has so far been anything but linear. He's just 21. He's already co-founded a startup, built a mobility platform that reached over $1 million in revenue, launched an AI-powered social app, Solo, in just 5 months, and recently joined a AI company that I think just about everyone in the world's probably heard of. With no further ado, welcome to I'm a Software Engineer, Ali.
Yeah, thaness for having me.
I'm going to kick off with the very obvious question about what have you been doing with your life, Ali? Like honestly, when are you going to lean in and start doing something interesting?
Yeah, I don't know. I just go with the flow. What can I say? I'm a beach bum at heart.
Seriously, I mean, I say that with the greatest respect because it's a fascinating story, even though it's quite short and compressed. It's a fascinating story already. What I normally do at this point is I normally ask people with grey hair who we've had on the show what they might do if they were able to ring their 25-year-old self, and it turns out that you're a few years away from being 25, and so that question doesn't work in your case. And so I thought about it over the weekend. I was reflecting on the chance to speak with you, and I thought, what if we turned the question around? We said, okay, what might you want to tell your 50-year-old self from your early 20s? You know, looking forward to the future. What are your aspirations? Where do you think the world's going to change? What little insights or reflections have you had so far in what's a relatively short career that you think might be useful for someone who's forgotten how that everything started off into the future?
That's an interesting point. So what I would tell my 50-year-old self, you're saying, so almost giving some advice to my older self. Well, I think I'm even starting to see kind of remnants of what I'm starting to feel I value, and I think what I'll likely value later in life. And I suppose how my lens of the world has been changing over the years, especially after, I guess, getting some experience, albeit in, as you mentioned, a very compressed period of time. But, you know, you start to appreciate life outside of work just as much. And although the achievements are fantastic, they're fleeting. And inevitably, you're kind of left chasing the next big thing. So I think it's important to keep yourself like anchored in, you know, other stuff in life, be it relationships, hobbies, those sorts of things. It's a bit cliche, you know, kind of be the well-rounded person. But I've definitely started to appreciate that stuff that much more as stuff, I guess, has been going as it has been.
Very mature for a 21-year-old to say that, I reckon.
I was just going to say, wise words. You're an old soul. You're an old soul, my friend. So why don't you take a moment then and tell us how you got here?
Yeah, sure.
What led up to this?
Well, I suppose for context, you know, I could start at the first startup, but I think there was time before that's worth mentioning. While I was in high school, I was like trying to find my identity, and there's this desire to search for something and craft your own or carve your own path. And I remember I was trying to find what that was for me. And in fact, I actually tried programming. It didn't stick. So instead, what I actually pursued was electronic music. So I was like producing electronic music in my bedroom. That was a lot of fun. And then I almost learned how to learn, if you will, without any sort of guidance or help, and doing it entirely at my own discretion without some like end goal in mind. And so that was fantastic. I think it was a very valuable lesson. And then I transferred that over into guitar, a lot of guitar in the later years of high school. And then when I got to university, I remember I was starting on a blank slate again. I'd kind of fallen in love with the previous things. And just by chance, I found the first startup I got involved in actually through my driving instructor, strangely enough. At this point in time, I was just very hungry for opportunity. So I was just desperate to get on board, and eventually it fortunately did. And I think those same principles I'd learned from, you know, working on stuff in my bedroom when I was younger, transferred very nicely into doing software. So yeah, I suppose from there it kind of snowballed. And the difference now is that instead of my work only having really visibility from myself, now there was visibility from like others. So it was kind of able to grow on its own from that point.
That's interesting. I've obviously known you for a while before you moved to the UK and joined Humanloop, but some of the conversations I've had with you, I felt was like you've got this great path and it's exciting and it's interesting. But from my conversations with you, you also had the aspirations of perhaps doing something different from what you did do. And that my memory is that you really wanted to go to the US and go to one of the sort of like Ivy League universities. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a typical high school student aspiration, right? But
Yeah.
but also it was interesting. Like it was also COVID time, and I remember being at this point in time, I was very fixated on my guitar and whatnot, and I was focusing on the university applications for the States. In my mind, like my narrow perspective of the world at the time, that was like the most important thing I could do in my life. So if that didn't work out, I knew I'd be like devastated. Yeah, I made those applications, and as these things go, it didn't work out, and like my alternative was to study in Cape Town, and that's definitely not what do you call it? It's not a compromise. In my mind, it was. But after my
Yeah.
first couple of months, I found I like fell in love with the place,
Oh, yeah.
and it wasn't only that. I also realized like there was opportunity at my doorstep. But again, you have to be the one to initiate and take it on yourself. You can't wait for it to just land in your lap.
You need a good driving instructor. Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's the trick.
That is fascinating. Was that the first company you joined while you were at university? Because you
Yeah.
joined one of the startups when you were at university. It sort of took over, really, didn't it, over your studies?
I remember there was actually quite a lot going on at that point in time. I remember that first year because again, I was just really craving to work on something at my own discretion, if you want. And there were actually three things I was involved at the time. I remember this machine learning research stuff competitions, and I fortunately did quite well in one, and they extended an offer to do like what was it, like a 6-month research contract. And then the other one was actually another startup that I found through my cousin. So again, it was just like all these things that were popping up, and I was just going at it. I was just very, very hungry for it. And fortunately, I was left with a couple of offers I could pick, but I knew that I couldn't do all three. Like I needed to be a bit realistic with that. So I decided to stick with two, and so I chose Loop, which was that company I found through my driving instructor. And this
Yeah.
other like mining tech startup that kind of took a back seat, but was doing kind of in like the extra time that I had.
I mean, I'm curious as to the role
Yeah.
of the driving instructor. There's a kind of there feels like there's some sort of, the universe is telling you something.
So, like I mentioned, I was doing my lessons, and my driving instructor mentioned he founded this mobility company. I can't remember how he pitched it, but it was very interesting as well because what the company was trying to do, and I suppose still is to digitalize/formalize the taxi industry in South Africa. And taxis in South Africa have like a certain connotation, like they're very notorious for being very lawless, still
Right.
cash-based, kind of avoiding taxes and all that stuff. And there's a lot of like gang warfare because these taxis operate in specific routes. So in my mind, I thought it was like a very unique South African problem. And I just loved it. Like it ticked all the boxes in my head of something that'd be cool to work on, like impactful and with promise, and not to mention great growth potential. But actually, funny enough, they didn't get me on board for a while because there was another software engineer at the time. He was the only one on board. He was actually like an intern at like Tesla or something from the States. He found the company in the same way I did, but he was like, no, I don't want a random student to join. So it took months. Eventually he left or parted ways with the company. And then at that point in time, they invited me to their office. They're working from like this co-working space in town. And I actually very vividly remember that day, like taking the university bus to town. And everyone else was going to the beach. I'm like, I'm off to do some like serious business. But I pulled up and they were working on some like WordPress website so you could like book a taxi. It's like just something basic, essentially like an Uber service. And all I knew in my mind was like, we must like centralize the data in the cloud. And that's what I said to them. They thought, wow, this guy's like a genius Zuckerberg. And, and then after that, they're like, okay, you're on board. And then after that, I spent a lot of time. I remember there was these like coffee shops nearby to where I was studying, and also a library. And I just go work there. And gradually, the basics. Yeah, it was a really cool experience that.
I can imagine. Yeah. And there would have been a time, I assume, because am I right in thinking that Loop still exists? So you decided to step away. Was that an easy decision?
No, not at all. I was there, I think, for like 1.5 years. And so I kind of like, I suppose, formed the foundations of the software. It was like fairly rudimentary, but nevertheless, it was, how do I say it? We were kind of both logistics company and a tech company, but the tech was a bit more, I would say, like didn't have as much depth as it needed to have quite yet. So I'm focusing more so on the logistics. But as time went on, we shifted our focus from the digital payments, which was doing quite well, but it wasn't keeping the lights on. And we focused on staff transport because we got some big contracts and whatnot. So we would essentially use those taxis, which are these sort of public, it's not really public transport, but they kind of function as public transport in South Africa, particularly for the low income population. Anyways, we provided additional revenue streams to those drivers through the staff transport. And I don't know, in my mind, I was starting to feel a little bit misaligned with what I felt I was getting on board with. But I totally understood, that's just the nature of business. And then there were multiple factors. Other one was like I was really becoming distant from like friends at university, and I knew my time was coming to an end. But this was my last year of university that I was starting to feel something's a bit off. So I thought, worst comes to worst, I can come back like a year later when I'm finished up. This time you just don't get back. And I remember there was sometime in February of last year. I thought, I think it's best to just take a step back from this. I just don't feel this is what I should be doing with my time right now. And yeah, at that point, kind of parted ways, but then did like a gradual handover to help them for a couple of months after.
Okay. But was it you then did your own thing? Was that after Loop or was that before Loop?
There was something on the side, but as I mentioned earlier, the kind of that mining tech thing, that was...
that was that. Yeah.
We were trying to join Y Combinator at the time, which was strange. So that was another thing. Like, I knew I couldn't pursue this thing anyways because I was involved in Loop. But then when I left Loop, I thought, okay, maybe I'll give that a go properly. The other person I was doing, my other co-founder, he was doing his master's in like robotics at ETH, which was quite cool. But that also, it felt like we're kind of just trying to come up with an idea for the sake of it. And that also just didn't feel quite right with me, especially at this point in time where I was like, I really want to be more deliberate with how I'm spending my time. But then that first semester of the year where I left Loop, I used that time to like just kind of rediscover myself, if you will. I joined a bunch of new clubs at university and just kind of enjoyed myself, focused on my studies a bit more. But then I did join another startup the second semester, kind of got pulled back in with my roommates, actually.
So very few people get to be involved in one successful startup in their career. Even fewer get multiple chances. And at the ripe old age of 21, you've managed to do it a couple of times. And so one of the other things that I'm fascinated by is pattern recognition, signals, right? How do we deal with complexity in the world? We look for signals, we have frameworks, and we try and sort of pull information out of these signals to help us make sense of it. And so I'm really, really curious to hear if you've spotted any patterns in this process so far, this 0 to 1 process, things that are interesting, things that and those patterns can be patterns or anti-patterns, things that you probably think, well, next time I do this, I'm not going to do that. Or next time I do this, I'm definitely going to do that.
It's actually a really good question, that, because all the startups were unique in their own way. Some things I'd preferred, and there wasn't necessarily a common thread amongst them all. But take, for example, Loop. Well, actually, what I will say was the common thread was, I guess, Peter Thiel popularized that concept of like 0 to 1 company, and he's like very set on that. He says like, if you're going to found a startup, it should be taking a concept from 0 to 1. I also I didn't want to do something that was just like slightly differentiated, but I understand there's nuance there as well. So take, for example, Loop. I like the idea. It was just a very unique idea within the South African context. And also there was something very authentic about it. The founders, for example, were from the taxi industry, which is very unusual because there were companies trying to, for example, digitalize the taxi industry, but a lot of them were like sort of these wealthier people approaching it from a perspective where, they just don't fully understand the inner workings of the industry. So that I like that aspect of it. Then the other aspect is obviously finding people you like enjoy working with, and you can tell they're like sharp and driven. It gives you faith that this thing's gonna...
What do you look for then in a co-founder? You've done it a couple of times now, and James and I have spoken about this before. That the co-founder question is a really interesting one because it's kind of like a marriage in many ways. Yeah. But with the difference that most people actually spend quite a bit more time before they get married. Often people jump into business relationships as if they're one night stands, and then they kind of wake up the next day and they found out they're kind of married to this person, and there's a whole bunch of unintended consequences that come with a co-founder relationship. So I'm curious if you've seen any patterns there after your couple of cracks at it so far that you would call out for others.
That's a good. I can't. I would say, especially when it comes to like the CEO, you want someone who's just like, what's the word? Relentless. Like just totally relentless. Like they will see this thing through no matter what. I don't think of myself as that kind of character. I like to sort of be more so the implementer or the technical person behind the scenes. But it's nice to have someone who complements me in that sense, who will drive this thing through, totally unapologetic about the idea. Relentless, but obviously like focused. You know, they know what's important at a particular period of time. They don't just work for the sake of it. I definitely noticed that at like Loop, as startups go, it's always like oscillating from highs to lows. It's never quite just this like linear trajectory that you would hope. Because I noticed that pattern recurring often. It's like you think this thing's about to take off and it's going to be a great success, and then all of a sudden it dips and you're like, what? I thought we're at the top of the world. So you want someone who's totally fine in those circumstances, who can push through that, because it's not always going to be highs.
You said something before, which I think there's another R word, which I think you probably have this, but you may or may not realize it. But you said before that you were singularly focused on getting into a US university, and then it didn't happen. And I was watching when you said it, I was listening to what you were going to say next. And the thing, you just basically picked yourself up and kept going and went on. And the next thing you did, you found joy in it or fulfillment in it, which is really interesting. And it's the R word there is resilience, right? The ability, I think resilience is of all the traits that someone can have that can make them happy, and which is really, what I would be indexing on is happiness. Resilience is one of the it's one of the secret superpowers of happiness, being able to pick yourself up. There's a great Chinese proverb: fall down 7 times, stand up 8.
That's a beautiful one, yeah.
And I really like that, because as someone who's fallen down a few times, you just got to keep getting up. Yeah. So that's I would add that to your repertoire: resilience.
No, I totally agree with that one for sure, because that's something I suppose I prided myself on, and I always remember that experience of, like, I suppose being devastated. I mean, it's definitely been dramatic, but in my mind, like, that was my only plan. And when you're left with nothing, you can kind of spiral downwards. But the important part is to, like, reframe it and say, like, okay, what can I do with this new experience? You know what I mean? How can I make the most of that? And pivoting, essentially. Yeah.
Ali, we spoke much earlier this year before you actually moved to London, and you were looking for a role in a startup. I think that's generally the thing you're looking for, but it was a bit of a search for you. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about what it was you were searching for? Because I know you were pretty set on moving to London, and now it's been 6 or 7 months in London, and you're already off to San Francisco. But do you want to tell us a little bit about that drive behind moving to London?
Yeah. Well, for one, my family was over in the UK, and then I also had something called pre-settled status, so essentially I had the right to work in the UK. And I thought it was just a no-brainer in terms of advancing my career. But then the other thing, I suppose, after leaving university, is that I was, somewhat disillusioned by, like, very early stage startups. I wasn't quite enjoying the scrappiness of it anymore, and it was becoming kind of like a repeated experience where I didn't feel there was much to be gained from that. And also I was lacking, like, the senior guidance. Like, I really, really enjoyed the broadness or the breadth of the responsibility I had, but now I was willing, I really wanted to look for depth. And I thought the UK would certainly be a great place to find that. I mean, London's tech scene is like the second, third biggest in the world. So I came over, and in truth, I was looking for actually like a scale up. So I suppose like a 200 plus person company. And I fortunately found a couple and got some offers. But then at the last minute, Humanloop reached out to me, and I told them, like, look, I need to have a decision by Friday. Can we fast track this? And fortunately they did. And then actually by the next Monday, on the train back home from London for my final interview, my boss, Peter, called me on the phone. He said, we want to give you an offer. The reason I went with that, even though it was a much smaller company than what I was looking for, is because there was definitely something about this place that I could feel was like really special. For one, just the people are very sharp, again, very driven, but also mature. And I think that's what stuck out to me. Like, this feels like a mature environment. Clearly, these people are experienced. And I just feel this would be like a really special place to work, and it'd be a real shame to pass on it. So I suppose it was like the wild card that worked out.
Yeah. Yeah. And then next thing you know, your company's being pretty much acquired. slightly different setup in what actually happened. But now you've got an opportunity to go to the States. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I suppose the other plans now to go to San Francisco. Yeah, just waiting on the visa.
Okay, so tell us who it is and what you're going to be doing.
The company, the company just happens to be MySpace.
They're making a comeback. They're making a comeback.
Very good, very good.
The company is Anthropic. It's now like sort of public news, but yeah, fortunately making my way over there. But a very exciting time to be a part of a company like that. It feels like.
And what are you going to be doing? Do you know, or do you have any idea what you're going to be doing? Yeah.
It's still like murky in terms of department and team, but at least for the start, I'm going to be working in the API team as a product engineer. But I'm yet to hear about like particular projects and stuff. But yeah, it will be exciting.
I mean, you probably can't talk about it now or maybe ever, but I'm super intrigued as someone who spent the last 6-7 months like really giving Claude Code a red hot go, and started out my sort of interaction with it was terrible. And I was burning more tokens than there was sane, and I wasn't getting anywhere with it. I was generating lots of really terrible code. And then I sort of got myself into a bit of a routine where I've now got quite a good process that I use. I call it intent, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm using the LLM to generate a bunch of intent, or help me capture intent for what I'm doing, which then allows me to keep things on the rails in a very focused way. And so now I'm absolutely loving it. But I'm really keen to know to what degree the engineers inside Anthropic are using Claude on a day-to-day basis to help them write code. I'd love to know the secrets.
Well, I suppose when you're selling it, you've got to make sure that you're touting it as much as possible. But
yeah,
it would be interesting to see for sure. Yet to find out.
I reckon you'd probably get a good rate, and you got quite reasonable API latency.
Well, I'm hoping for I'm just hoping they'll pay for my Claude subscription, because
I'm sure they will.
But in all seriousness though, how much of a role let's leave Anthropic out of it specifically, but like how much of a role has AI tooling played in what you've been able to do in the last 12 months?
That's a good question. I suppose unfortunately, I like all the software engineering stuff I learned was like pre-LLMs. It's funny because it's like there's this boundary in time where
Same.
right? It really was that significant. But
common ground.
More recently, actually, surprisingly, a lot, especially with 0 to 1 stuff.
Yeah.
Particularly with 0 to 1 stuff, when I was dealing with like deploying stuff in the cloud and like defining resources and using infrastructure as code. A lot of this stuff is like boilerplate and just need to read a lot of documentation online. But then when it comes to actually dealing with legacy code bases, I'm sure this has been heard. We hear this time and time again, but it's not quite as effective. It is getting really good though, at like searching through code bases. But I try to actually use it as little as possible, just to keep myself sharp and not overly reliant on it, because it does become a crutch for sure.
Interesting.
But I would say substantial. Yeah.
Yeah, I have the opposite problem. I've the opposite problem. I'm trying to use it as much as possible because it's such a lever, and I just don't have the time otherwise. So it's just me and one other person writing code. So yeah, I've used it way too much, and my brain's probably now shriveled to the size of a walnut because I've handed off too much. What is it called? Cognitive offload has been too great. But so I don't know. I mean, in all seriousness though, how do you see this changing? Like, what's the as someone who's quite literally at the coalface of this, what do you see the job of a programmer looking like in the next couple of years?
I think like everyone else, started quite pessimistic or cynical, but then gradually we've seen the capabilities get so good that it's quite hard to deny like how good it is. My suspicion is that. This is obviously quite a bold claim, but like in my opinion, I suspect it's inevitable that we'll see probably mass replacement of the role of a software engineer. I think for one, it's because the tooling that we use is all digital. So it's a perfect interface for AI, at least at the moment. We don't need to wait for like these sophisticated robots. And also with context windows growing and it becoming more clever in terms of how to integrate LLMs. Because obviously like a raw LLM is only so useful, but now we've got like tool calling and just more clever ways, I suppose, of using it. And we're starting to think about interface design for AI. That's why we're seeing, for example, like these agentic coding assistants like in the terminal. So yeah, gradually we'll see, I suppose, more responsibilities being offloaded.
So let me push on that a bit.
Yeah.
When you said mass replacement of programmers, what advice would you give to someone 10 years younger than you, say, right, who's looking at a career, is excited by the technology, the possibilities, what would you say to that person in light of where you think this is going?
Yeah. I'd say run. No, I'm kidding. It's no, but in all truthfulness, like it is just a question of like how long it would take to see it happen. And I just don't think that's a good way to think about it. Like all you can do is all one can do is work with the information you have at your disposal currently. And as it stands now, there's definitely a big role of like software engineers in coding. Like with its current capabilities, I definitely do not see it being as effective as like your typical like sort of mid-level engineer or whatever. So it's about keeping sharp and making sure you on its own. Sorry, that's right. About keeping sharp, not totally what's the word? Avoiding
abrogating the responsibility.
Yes, I think if I'm understanding correctly.
Abrogating, giving up.
That's right.
Yeah.
So yes, but not also being so dogmatic about not using AI stuff. Like sort of finding a middle ground, help using it to accelerate learning, but being mindful about it. I suppose we see much the same with like social media. Like you can use it as like an effective tool for like expanding your horizons and learning different perspectives, but it can also be a tool for like misinformation and mindless scrolling. Exactly. So it's just a matter of being mindful about it. Easier said than done. But yeah, doing things from first principles is really, I want to say underrated, but everyone talks about it. It's like, it's very valuable.
You've actually touched on a couple of things that we've said in a few previous episodes. One in particular, there was a tweet that I think you found this tweet, James, and someone said, running away from software engineering today would be like a carpenter running away from carpentry after seeing a circular saw for the first time. And I just wonder if we do get rid of software engineers. I think software engineers start doing slightly different things. And I think the things that become important for software engineers to do, the ratio of those things change. But do you know what the hard bit of software always was people. And I don't think that changes. Right. In many ways, the easy bit of software was the typing, the writing of the code, and all. Well, not all, but one of the things an LLM does right now is the time cost of writing the code is almost zero. Like if you've got the right idea and you know the right questions and you've got a rough kind of a set of instructions you can give it, you can go do this. And if you don't like the code, which takes 2 minutes for it to write, you can go throw that away and do it this way. Right. Yeah. And there's no remorse for throwing away 5,000 lines of code because it only took it 2 minutes to write it anyway. And so I think what happens is that programmers don't disappear. They take on a new role, this sort of hypervisor role, where you sort of elevate you still need to know, like you've obviously got the right instincts, but a muppet sitting there generating hundreds of thousands of lines of rubbish code doesn't have the instinct to go, no, this is terrible. I literally need to throw away 80% of that. And if we train good new software engineers who can look at what these things are outputting and be able to tune the dials on them so that they're actually out, like the stuff we throw away the crap and hang on to the good bits, which are definitely in there. If we don't have that, I think we're in real trouble. And I think throwing away, like there's this view I'm going to get on my soapbox. There's this view in the industry that we're just going to get rid of all the software engineers and we're going to have managers just writing code in Lovable. Managers just not writing code. Managers just emitting stuff from Lovable. And I don't see that as the future any more than what happened in the 80s when SQL came along, and every single late 80s, early 90s, every single application, there weren't apps then, but every single application had an SQL interface, and they was expecting managers to write SQL, so we didn't need programmers. How did that turn out? Well, guess what happened? The database became an appliance. The SQL, which is still the interface to the database, is now a programming interface where there's an application layer is instrumenting the database, right, via using SQL, and then it's presenting some kind of application functionality to the user. I think we see the same thing with these technologies. The LLM becomes a commodity, maybe not a commodity in the sense that it's cheap, but it becomes an appliance with an enormous amount of functionality. And then our job as programmers is to work out how to wield that functionality in a way that users can understand, right? That's a job for a human, not a machine. So I don't think we go away. I just think we have to get better at dealing with people.
It really is such a broad discussion. It's like something, admittedly, I don't think I think carefully about enough. But even when it comes to like writing code, I think I saw some like talk recently where they were doing some analysis in terms of the productivity gains that you get using AI, specifically in software. And it's not what it seems. I don't know how they typically measure it, but effectively what they were saying, using through the infographics was that short, outputting a lot more code, but then there's also time spent refactoring and like removing stuff. Whereas if you maybe instead of spending all that time like defining your requirements and whatnot into this thing and then changing it in the future anyways, if you just went and did it yourself from the beginning, what is the net productivity gain there? But yeah, it's an interesting thing.
There's a paper that was done by BCG and I think Harvard. Gosh, fact check me there, but it was BCG and someone. I used to work for BCG, so I was on the inside there, called the Jagged Frontier. And actually what you're reflecting there, like your sort of intuition is bang on. What happens is it's not this flat frontier of expansion and productivity. There's bits of it where you get a ridiculously high return, and then there's other bits of it where you actually get negative returns because it's not applied properly. And what was interesting was the returns to mid-level folks were quite good, but the returns to quite experienced or higher performers was nowhere near as high as it was for less quality performers, which I think is a really interesting. I think that's a really interesting result because that leads you to somewhere a bit different than it might if you just said, "Oh, we're just going to give everyone a jetpack," right? Because it's some people are going to take that jetpack and they're going to fly into a wall because they don't know how to drive it.
It's a clever metaphor, that.
I would say from a career perspective, obviously a lot of software engineers are worried. A lot of people think about, oh gosh, what's going to happen to software engineer? But I feel like software engineering is the focus of a lot of without these software products, we have nothing. And you're going to need people in that space, regardless if the role changes. Whereas some careers are probably at a lot more risk than software engineering. I feel like software engineering gets a lot of attention though, probably because purely AI can produce code, but we all know that there's a lot more to the role of a software engineer. So I think it's a complex debate that will go on, and we will see software engineers doing very similar stuff, at least for the next few years.
So, Ali, you are literally at the center of what's next. When you wake up in San Francisco, whatever that is, the next few weeks, I was saying to James earlier, it'd be like getting a job at Microsoft when there was 50 people there, or I think there's a few more people now at Anthropic than 50, but you're right in the guts of it. The way the world changes over the next 5 to 10 years is definitely going to come out of companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, and of course you've got the old guard there. What does Microsoft do? What does Apple do? What does Google do? Never underestimate a company with $3 trillion capital base behind it. You'd be a fool to do that. So there's a really interesting strategic question about whether the incumbents get to bolt on AI more quickly to their existing businesses than the new entrants get to acquire customers on top of the new technology, right? And there's this sort of tension between those two things. But you've picked a lane in this role. So I'm interested. What are your aspirations for working at somewhere like Anthropic? What do you want to look back in 5 years' time having done?
Yeah, it's a great question, that, because for sure I think it's important to know that going into the role so you can kind of make the most of it as well. Because it's a fantastic opportunity, but like this is where things start. It's not like where the road ends. But for me, I don't think it's necessarily like a particular project or anything like that, but definitely want to learn as rapidly as possible. Not network for the sake of like gaining something from it, but like develop some interesting perspectives, some really cool ideas. This is like a very generic response, to be honest. It's like something I probably should think more carefully on. But ideally, yeah, like move up into a role with more seniority and kind of like take the lead on some projects as well. That would be fantastic.
Have you got any particular domains? Like, so if we concede that effectively these companies are building general intelligence on one level, right? And there's a question to what extent it becomes AGI, and there's an even bigger question about whether it becomes sentient or conscious, or even if that is a thing that is a characterized, right? I mean, we could have a whole philosophical argument for hours on that question, but there's no doubt that they're intelligent, right? And there's also, in my mind, no doubt that they're generally intelligent, and they're certainly artificial. It's just that they're better at some things than others, for humans at some things than others. And so I'm curious, given that you're effectively working for a company with a platform for general intelligence, and let's concede that keeps improving, what do you think are some of the domains in which this could be best applied?
Oh, interesting. So is that more high level you're saying now? Like where do I see it, or where would I like to see it go?
Yeah, where would you? I mean, look, you've had extraordinary success in a short period of time. It's been recognized as such, and now you've been put into a situation where you may have an opportunity to influence where this goes. Where do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think there's like sort of some low-hanging fruit like healthcare, where just not enough people have access. It's a very obvious one. I think it would be a great place to have supplemented with AI. So I suppose maybe that's the core theme there is I'd like to see it be supplementing work or supplementing labor rather than replacing it. So especially in domains where there is just a shortfall of labor or there's a shortfall of supply in relation to demand. Healthcare is an obvious one, but the problem with it as well at the moment is like there's this tension between economic incentives and wanting to have it have like a positive impact on the world. And the fact of the matter is it is showing like real promise in kind of all domains that involve any kind of cognitive effort. And so for that reason, there's like a lot of work that's really threatened. So, I mean, my hope is really that it can just be applied in like a thoughtful way. I think I'd be naive to say that, oh, we can just avoid like replacing some people or at least displacing a lot of the workforce. I think it might just, in my opinion, really, it might just be a reality of this. But the question is, how can these like top companies do it in a way that's thoughtful that they can, for example, communicate the risks to like policymakers and that sort of thing beforehand? Which I know they're doing, for example, like San Francisco. It's actually quite interesting, the back and forths between the policymakers and the companies. Because like sometimes the policies aren't forward thinking enough. And so they go back to the company like, well, what do you think? So yeah.
This is a really good segue into my last question I wanted to talk about, right? Because one of the things I like about Anthropic, of all the companies that are operating in this space, Anthropic is the one for me that has the best taste. And I use that word specifically because if you remember, there's a great quote or a video grab of Steve Jobs one time just talking about the other company that they were battling with at the time, and he just makes this really emphatic, simple statement: they just have no taste. And it always stuck with me. I mean, there's a lot of problems with Steve Jobs and all that sort of stuff, and so I concede that as well. But it just always stuck with me that is true. Apple just does have quite good taste as a rule. Sometimes they put it in front of everything else, and it kind of gets in the way. But generally speaking, they make the right decisions. And when you apply taste to artificial general intelligence, I think it's there's a really interesting question here about responsible AI. What is responsible AI? And the reason I mention Anthropic as having a bit more respect for than some of the other players is they seem to be very focused on AI safety, very focused. And so they've delayed releases a few times because they had some concerns about safety. And so for me, whenever a company does something that's clearly almost operates against its financial interests, because any delay in this space is more money burnt and maybe the other guys get in front of you a little bit, but just to have the taste to realize that AI safety was an interesting thing. I gave them a bunch of points. So given that framing, how worried are you about these technologies getting away from us?
You like sort of a runaway feedback loop kind of thing, self-improving, or really
becoming dangerous enough to present an existential threat to humans. Yeah.
I think it's obviously, I mean, the question really, my answer really is totally uninformed. But I would say, in truth, if we're to look at it on a spectrum, I definitely tip towards more so a bit pessimistic or concerned. I think there's just too many plays in the space. It's moving so fast, and the incentives are just too great to stop bad actors from, maybe not even bad actors, but people are just blinded by this incredible new invention. And I mean, just look at, for example, like the amount of venture capital that's going into it. You've got just a bunch of new startups emerging from this, and it's just relentless. So, truth, I'm a bit concerned, but I do see a path forward towards something that works. Like that just works for most of humanity. I don't know what that looks like, but yeah, I suppose the concern really is like more so the transitional phase, like when we're still grappling with these questions of like, let's just say, for example, like a proportion of the workforce is displaced, but what happens to them? Is it a matter of doing something like UBI and then what about like wealth creation as well? That's a very tough question because you can imagine like a post-AI world, if it really is this one that people envision where no one's working anymore, or like a post-work world, there's no class mobility anymore. And so people who have people who have land and property and stuff, now they're just holding these assets and the other people are just kind of left for dead. What happens there? So,
Well, if this was an
yeah, I don't
episode
know.
of if this is an episode of Gary's Economics, we could go into that, because I have some strong views on that
Yeah,
stuff. But
actually,
let's not do that. Let's
yeah. So just going to add, it was funny because I ran past Karl Marx's tomb today. He's actually buried in North London. I couldn't believe it.
Was there a reason that you ran past that today, or just
No,
coincidence?
no, well, just I saw it on the map because I wanted to check
Ah.
out like Hampstead Heath. It's right next to it. So I saw it on the map. I was like, oh, that's cool. I should go check it out. I even paid £7 to to get in
To view
there.
it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder
That's
where
hilarious.
that £7
Yeah.
has gone.
To be fair, they do put a lot of work into that cemetery. So yeah.
Yeah. I want to end on a positive note, if I can, because I think there's a lot of AI, there's a lot of cynicism, and actually a lot of it comes from like the sort of Hacker News. There's a sort of Hacker News group of software engineers who really just seems to be their daily sport is to tear down AI, which I find quite bizarre, because I actually think it's probably going to be one of the most profound technologies that humanity's made since the printing press. And I think it has all of the positives and negatives, or upside and downside consequences. So the printing press democratized access to religion, right, and triggered the Enlightenment and the separation of church and state, and possibly 300 years of progress that we haven't seen in 20,000 years of human history prior to that. But it also resulted in a whole bunch of wars, a whole bunch of new political movements that came and went, with the consequences that go with that in people dying. In the 20th century was a pretty grim, looking back at it, it was a pretty grim place. To get from the 19th century to the 21st century, 200 million people around the world died in wars. We are, talking about boundary conditions, sort of to wrap up on one of our major themes, we are at possibly one of the biggest boundary conditions that species could come across, which is the invention of a new intelligence. Okay, not one that's been formed from the natural environment. And so there's a ton of risks, but I think there's a ton of upsides. And so I want to finish maybe on thinking about some of the upsides. So for me, I think the only way we solve things like climate crisis and wealth inequality is with intelligent machines helping humans work it out, right? Because there's one thing we have seen over the last 30 years is that if you just leave humans to it, they end up hoarding a whole bunch of it for themselves and not sharing it. And so I wonder what the opportunities are with, you mentioned the software engineers going away. I actually think that someone can sit down at their desk and they can build a business that does all of the things that a business needs to do with the help of these tools. And that was never true before. You needed lawyers and accountants. I mean, you still need them, obviously, to sign off on things, but you can do an NDA in 2 minutes, right? You can get a red line through a contract, and it's not legal advice, and I'm not giving legal advice. I'm not suggesting, blah, 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 blah. But if someone sends you a contract and you can go, can you redline this for me and tell me what I need to ask my lawyer about? It can do that in 2 minutes. And previously that would have been 500 quid's worth of phone calls and interactions with a lawyer. So I think these things are enormously productivity enhancing, right? Right. And particularly for entrepreneurs. For me, these things unlock enormous possibility for entrepreneurship. Absolutely enormous possibility.
Yeah. No, those are some really good points you made then. I totally agree. I was like focusing more so on the long-term horizons and also it's just one angle to look at it at. But like you mentioned, the printing press democratized, or was it religion? I suppose what AI is doing is democratizing intelligence. Now
Yeah.
everyone's got this like genius in their pocket. And as you mentioned, they can
Yeah.
review paper documents and whatnot that otherwise they wouldn't be able to carefully
Yeah.
or rigorously go through. And
Yeah.
all sorts of other things, really. There's certainly a
Yeah.
lot of
I've said this.
fruitery from it.
I've said this a few times talking to clients and businesses. Imagine if everyone in your workforce had a little co-pilot sitting on their shoulder and up their IQ by 10 IQ points. Right?
Yeah.
Imagine. So rather than thinking about how I replace my staff with AI, what about if I give everyone 10 extra IQ points? How much better can this business be on the same cost base, but with this extra capability?
So yeah, appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, we look forward to following your journey over the next few years and seeing what exciting things come out of Anthropic.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks for being here. It was a great chat, Ali. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers.